The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today and for your interest in Netwrix. Hope you're having a great week so far. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depends on what part of the world you're connecting from. My name is David Metzgar. I'm a solutions engineer here at Netwrix, as well as a Microsoft certified trainer for over 20 years now. I'm going to be joined today by Sander Berkouwer, and he has his own set of credentials in his own right, including being a Microsoft certified trainer, which is not on this screen. Long list of credentials that wouldn't fit. We're going to be discussing the topics of Active Directory and Azure Directory, not either or, but both and, how they can work together, maximize their value. So I know there are many challenges that organizations face to ensure that their Active Directory domains, as well as their Azure Active Directory tenants, are secure, while also providing the functionality that they need. So hopefully you will come away from this webinar, as well as Thursday's session, with a better understanding of how to maximize the value of these two foundational services. But before we get started, there's some housekeeping that we need to be aware of. First of all, this session is being recorded, and you will be sent, once the sessions are over, links to the slides and to the presentation. If you missed any piece, you have to step away for a moment or whatever, you'll be able to go back and revisit some of the topics we've been covering. You also will be able to submit your questions in the GoToWebinar panel, and there'll be a time at the end of our session where we'll address some of the questions based on how much time we have, that you don't have to wait till the very end of our session, our discussion, our presentation to put your questions in there. We can kind of queue them up, and then as based on how much time we have at the end, we'll address those questions and answer as many as we can. The session duration is going to be up to 60 minutes, so it depends on how time goes. We'll try to keep it under 60 minutes and have you go about your day. And before we dive into the presentation itself, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what to expect in our session. The first two topics, and the majority of our session, is going to be Sander presenting on the benefits of Active Directory and Azure Active Directory and how they can work together, complement one another, as well as the focus on security for those services. And at the second part of it, I'm going to be going into a demonstration of how Netwrix can help provide visibility into the activity in both your on-premise Active Directory as well as in Azure Active Directory. And like I said, if there's enough time at the end for some Q&A, we'll handle any questions you put in the area when we get there. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Sander. He'll take over from here, and take it away, Sander.
Thank you, David. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are. And let's talk about Active Directory and Azure AD today. And my opinion is that even the most out of date, out of touch Active Directory admin, even the most security oriented and end user focused Active Directory admins can benefit from adding Azure AD to their Active Directory environments. And let's be very concise about this. What we're seeing in the world today is that there are organizations that started with Active Directory and are now adding Azure Active Directory to the mix. Of course, we're also seeing some organizations with just Azure AD. And these are organizations that no longer carry around the burden of Kerberos and NTLM, but we're going to focus on the first type of organizations. So the organization that already has Active Directory, that continues to need Active Directory, but can truly benefit from adding Azure AD to that mix. And if you add Azure Active Directory to your Active Directory, you get what I call, and what Microsoft calls, hybrid identity. And hybrid identity means, if you look it up in the documentation from Microsoft, there's all these fancy words. It means extending on-premises Active Directory domain services to Microsoft's Azure Active Directory service. But that's a lot of words, and some people lose their way if they read so many things. And it's, of course, it is very concise, it is very exact, but what we're seeing is that nobody calls Active Directory domain services Active Directory domain services. Of course, you have Active Directory federation services and certificate services, but most people just call Active Directory Active Directory. And furthermore, what we're seeing is that Active Directory is no longer just on premises. We're seeing domain controllers in Azure Infrastructure as a Service, in AWS, in VMware Cloud, and everywhere. So it's no longer the typical on-premises Active Directory that we're seeing. We're just seeing Active Directory. And if we're talking about Azure AD, then yes, that's a service, but everybody knows that's Microsoft services, right? Everybody knows that that service runs in Microsoft's data centers, practically all of them. And they consume over 300,000 CPUs just to run Azure AD for us. And then to put that into perspective, I added a little picture that displays how that works. So you have your Active Directory, you have your domain controllers, and you have domain joint machines. And typically, to extend to Azure AD, you would add Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is Microsoft's free product to do so. You install it on a Windows server, could be the existing domain controller. I would advise against that, but you could. And of course, that Azure AD Connect installation then synchronizes objects and their attributes. We call properties attributes in Active Directory to the Azure AD service, to Microsoft's data centers. Now, there are a lot of reasons why organizations implement hybrid identity. There are a lot of reasons why organizations extend their Active Directory to Azure AD. And the most prevailing one is to achieve single sign-on. And single sign-on is often touted as end-user convenience, because when you achieve single sign-on, you just go to a portal and an application or a service or a system, and you don't have to present your credentials again. That's single sign-on. Of course, as Active Directory admins, we've known single sign-on for decades already. If you're signed into your domain joint device, you go to a file server, you don't have to present your credentials. You already have single sign-on based on Kerberos or NTLM. But you can't use those same protocols to go to cloud apps, because it is a very unwise idea to talk Kerberos to cloud applications, because cloud applications typically don't run or they aren't accessible through trusted networks. And Kerberos was invented, well, way before the internet actually became popular, and it was designed for trusted networks that you could actually trust. So not for the internet. For the internet, we have very different protocols like WSFAT and SAMO and SCIM that we use to get single sign-on. And all those protocols are native to ADFS, but there's not a lot of organizations deploying ADFS these times. And of course, they're native to Azure AD. So now, what we're seeing is these organizations, to achieve single sign-on, are bolting on Azure AD as a highly redundant, globally available ADFS as a service solution. And of course, when you achieve single sign-on, when you go to an application, you normally don't get asked for your credentials. So if someone is fishing for your credentials, the first thing that he or she will do is present you with a credential screen, because he or she is after your credentials. If you always have single sign-on, and now all of a sudden you have a credential screen popping up, yeah, that will raise some eyebrows. And that's how single sign-on increases your organization's resilience against phishing attacks. And this is something that is often overlooked by organizations when creating a business case for this type of products, but that's what we're seeing. Now, of course, if you have Azure Active Directory, you can also benefit from all the cloud-based artificial intelligence or machine-based learning that's available in Microsoft's cloud, in Microsoft's data centers from an identity point of view. So you can use Azure Connect Health to detect and report on issues with your hybrid identity components. Azure Connect Health for Azure Connect itself is built in. Azure Connect will just send its vitals to Azure AD, and then if there's something wrong, you will get a notification as an admin that will say, you know what, your Azure Connect is a little off. But it can do the same with your ADFS servers, with your domain controllers, and with your web application proxies. So all these hybrid identity components, whether you use them with Azure AD or not, you can use that cloud artificial intelligence to get those notifications that something is wrong. You don't have to federate your Azure AD tenant with your ADFS servers to do so, to get the notifications for ADFS. All you need to do is install that Azure Connect Health agent, and it will send vitals, and it will feed that artificial intelligence to get you those notifications. Of course, there's also Azure AD Identity Protection, and I'm covering that more later on one of the slides, but it helps you assess each and every sign-on for possible risk. So as an admin, you actually get risky users and risky sign-ins delivered to you. So if there's something going on, Azure AD probably is going to be the first service to actually alert you for who it is going wrong. And of course, you can use Defender for Identity for anomaly detection on your Active Directory domain controllers. If you're worried about all the newest attacks like Kerber roasting and skeleton key attacks and stuff like that, then Defender for Identity is something that you can use. You only install an agent on your domain controller, and the machine learning in Azure will send you notifications when something is wrong, and it will allow you to hunt for anomalies as well. And then, of course, what we're seeing is that most vendors for identity and access management, for IAM solutions, are now focusing on Azure AD and bringing value to organizations that have Azure AD. And some of these IAM solutions are already born in the cloud. They don't care about Active Directory anymore. When you have new people coming into your organizations, they don't provision user accounts in Active Directory. No, they provision user accounts in Azure AD. And that's where everything is happening. And that's where more and more of that value is brought to. And of course, all that value, for instance, value with self-service group memberships that you can benefit from, can then be written back to your Active Directory. So you don't need additional on-prem systems, you don't need additional infrastructure, you don't need to patch additional servers. You just hook up a cloud service to your Azure AD, and your Azure AD is already hooked up to your Active Directory, and you're done. So we're seeing all these streams converge at the moment towards that one goal for organizations, for AD admins, to add Azure AD, to implement hybrid identity like this. But today I want to talk with you about configuring infrastructure security services. So about that that second block of benefits that you can have. And there's a lot of things that we can do. And the cornerstone of securing your infrastructure services to securing your access is through conditional access. And conditional access is completely different to anything that we've had up to this time in Active Directory. In Active Directory, typically we have access control lists, ACLs, with access control entries, ACEs, that actually allow or deny access to something like a file share or a shortcut to an application or a data folder in an application or a role in an application. And of course, we do have some dynamic access control since Windows Server 2012 in Active Directory, but there's not a lot of organizations that are actually using that, and it is typically a solution that is embraced by organizations if they encounter token bloat issues, or if they get up to the 1015 group memberships for users where they can no longer sign in as a normal user account. Admins can still log on, but normal user accounts will just stop working. And dynamic access control is sort of the same thing. You still get, with dynamic access control, you get claims in your Kuros tokens. And with conditional access, you already have the claims in your claims token from Azure Active Directory. And these claims are then interpreted by Azure AD. And that interpretation is completely different to Active Directory. So in Active Directory, we walk through the ACLs and the ACEs, but in conditional access, we can define access based on the same group memberships, obviously, but also the application used. Are you using a browser, or are you using a certain application? Are you using POP3 or IMAP, or are you using ActiveSync or some other newer Exchange Online protocol? And these are the things that define access. If you're going from a browser to your mailbox, or if you're using Outlook to a mailbox, you can actually have different access. From a browser, for instance, you can have only read-only access, so you couldn't send email, or you couldn't download your attachments from your emails. And then, of course, that only applies to Exchange Online. So in SharePoint Online, for instance, you could still download, or you could also not download. But we can granularly dial those knobs in conditional access and say, you know what, there's access here, there's access there, but we're not going to provide access somewhere else. And we can have deny, and we can have allow, but we can have way more things. And we can also interpret that identity protection risk score and leverage that and say, you know what, you still have a domain joined Azure AD joined device, but it is associated with some risk, or it is not compliant with Intune or a third-party MDM solution. So unless you update your antivirus solution, for instance, we'll just give you read-only access. Or, and this is the fun part, because now we go to the slide that gives it all, we can require multi-factor authentication, or we can require all the controls that we have on the right side of the conditional access model. So when we access anything through Azure AD, the user attributes, the device attributes and status, the location, and the app that you use are all taken into account. They are mangled through that machine learning that offers you a session risk. There's conditional access policies that define that access and will provide you with an effective policy, and that is real-time evaluated And then the control will say, you know what, we're going to ask you something. So if someone with a user account that has a high user risk, for instance, because identity protection, and that's all the data that is poured into this model from the top, if identity protection has found that your credentials have leaked in some leak somewhere else, and that leak includes your email address, then when you access your mailbox, conditional access will actually ask you to reset your password, because that's one of the services, self-service password reset, that Azure AD offers from the box to all persons that have an Azure AD premium license. Now, this is all Azure AD premium, but identity protection, for instance, and all that logic also applies to Azure AD free, and it also applies to your Microsoft account, for instance. So even on your Microsoft account, if it uses the same email address, you could still get that password reset option on your Microsoft account as well. And that's a personal account. You don't pay any fee for that. And this model allows you to really granularly define access to any app, to any service based on any property of your user device account, your location, like an email, like an IP address, or like a country, for instance. Those are all available in conditional access. So, David, if we could switch to the browser, I can actually show people how conditional access looks. Here we go.
How about that? Is that good?
That is perfect. Thank you. So this is the Azure AD portal. This is the security part. So I'll go to conditional access, and there's already some policies here, but I can add a new policy. And I've clicked it, and now I have to give it a name. So let's quickly type a name. That sounds perfect. And now we're gonna see who we are going to apply it to. And I can say, you know what, I want it to apply to all users or just select users. And I could say, you know what, there's a couple of directory roles that I think require some more stringent access controls. So, for instance, let me, know what here? The attack payload author and the attack simulation administrator. Those are roles in the E5 licensing. So let's get those two directory roles. So every person that I have or I am going to give that directory role is actually going to get this conditional access policy applied. And of course, I can exclude people as well, but this is great. We now have people in a certain role. Let's apply this to all the cloud apps, but we can also say select apps, for instance, and then select some apps, and there's an entire list of apps that we could apply this to. But let's just say all cloud apps. And then conditions. Here's the user risk, the sign-in risk. Here's the device platform that we've talked about. So I can say that I want this to apply to only certain devices. Here's location. So I can say, you know what, when you're in the office, this doesn't apply to you. I can do things with client apps. And it's currently not configured, but I think you catch my drift. And I can do things with device state, for instance. But I'm not going to do anything like that today. I'm just going to say that I want to grant it. And that's that. And let me, there's something in the way here. Let's see if I can get that to multi-factor authentication. Here we go. And you can even go wild and ask for something else. So for instance, if they have a device, then you could do that, or a hybrid device, something like that. You can require that. And of course, you can say, you know what, I want one, or you can say, you know what, I want both. So this makes it really, really tough to break into from the outside. So let's do that. And from a session perspective, I think everything's fine here. So that's cool. Now the policy is report only by default. We can turn it on and then create it. And now what you'll see is that this conditional access policy is added to the policies that we've already created. So we've created a policy that requires MFA, and we've already created a policy that disables legacy authentication because legacy authentication protocols don't do multi-factor authentication. So now for my Azure AD integrated applications, I've done this. And that adds security to all those cloud applications. But David, if we go back to the slides, let's see what else is in store, because we cannot just apply conditional access to your resources in Azure AD, but we can also apply it to all the cloud applications that are federated with Azure AD, and even on-premises applications that we have federated with Azure AD. So if you have current on-premises applications that you have federated with ADFS, you could actually just switch that up and change that federation from ADFS to Azure AD. And there's a guide in Azure AD for your applications as well. Microsoft will actually tell you for your applications which applications you could transform to federate with Azure AD without changing any of the code of those applications. And you can use the Azure AD app proxy, which is your hybrid identity Swiss Army knife of tools, to add Azure AD authentication to any app that uses Windows integrated authentication, forms-based authentication, header-based application, or even your remote desktop applications. And you could add multi-factor authentication to all these apps in one fell swoop with conditional access policies. Now, graphically, what that looks like is if you have a cloud application that is integrated with Azure Active Directory, what would actually happen is that a user accesses a cloud application and gets redirected to Azure Active Directory, the conditional access. You could authenticate to conditional access, and then conditional access would get all that feed from identity protection. It would authenticate you to Azure Active Directory. It would trigger multi-factor authentication if need be, and then send you back the token that you need for your cloud application, so you could send it to the cloud application and be signed in. So this is straightforward. This is what everybody gets in the first run. So let's talk about a different application now. Let's talk about an application that is on-prem, and that's a web application. So again, you go to the on-premise web application, you get redirected to Azure Active Directory to conditional access. We still have that identity protection feed. You would authenticate with Azure Active Directory. That could be single sign-on. Then you would get multi-factor authentication if need be, and then Azure Active Directory would give you the token that you need to present to your on-premises web application to actually sign in. And that token is signed by Azure Active Directory, and that signing certificate is actually exchanged between your on-premises web application and Azure Active Directory as part of the relying party trust. So again, this works. Of course, it breaks if your internet connection breaks, but there's a lot more that breaks in your organization when the internet connection breaks. Trust me. And there's a third way, and that's the Azure AD App Proxy. So you would install that on your on-premises web application or close to it. And that Azure AD App Proxy agent would communicate to the Azure AD App Proxy service by an outgoing connection. So what you would see is that the Azure AD App Proxy sets up a tunnel to your Azure AD App Proxy server, to the Azure AD App Proxy service through an outgoing HTTPS connection. So there's nothing that we need to do in terms of firewall or anything like that. Now you point the user to the Azure AD App Proxy endpoint for that application. The user is then redirected to Azure Active Directory, signs in there. You know the drill. We get signed in. We need to do multi-factor authentication if need be. You get a token back. At the end, you present that token to the Azure AD App Proxy, and the Azure AD App Proxy then puts all the traffic, all the packets for that application on the Azure Service Bus that the Azure AD App Proxy agent looks at. So the Azure AD App Proxy sees that run-of-the-mill Azure Service Bus flow, and it sees packets, and it just picks up the packets and it just consumes them. And for instance, it says, you know what, you're a Windows integrated application, so we need to integrate, we need to perform that integrated authentication with Active Directory. We do that. We get authenticated as well through Kerberos constraint delegation. And then through that same Azure Service Bus, we get the package back to our user. And we actually use that application. Of course, the tricky part is applying Azure multi-factor authentication. And the really smart thing that Microsoft have done is they've created that one MFA registration in Azure AD. And in all the models that I've just shown you, you can use that one MFA registration just like that. So if I have an Azure AD integrated application, it has a relying party trust, it points to Azure AD, it can use that one MFA registration, we're good to go. If I have that federated application on premises, I can use an Azure MFA adapter that I install on ADFS. On Windows Server 2016 and Windows Server 2019 ADFS, that Azure MFA adapter is already installed. I only need to register it. And that points to that MFA registration. And when I go to the federated application, I get pointed to ADFS. And in the ADFS claims issuance rules, I can request or I can require multi-factor authentication. And the Azure MFA adapter will actually go to Azure AD and get that MFA registration and get that done. But even if you have a legacy application, for instance, that uses Radius, I can have the Azure MFA extension for NPS, for Network Protection Services, installed on my Radius servers. And when I go to that application, it can actually use the same MFA registration as well. So we can use that with the RD Web Gateway. We can use that with VMware Horizon. We can use that with anything that we need. And that way, there's basically no applications that we can't use that one MFA registration with. Now, the other thing is we can use Azure AD Password Protection. And in Azure AD Password Protection, we can actually define that we don't want the top 1,000 leaked passwords, and we don't want people to create easily guessable passwords like welcome or passwords that contain spring or autumn or fall or the year 2020 or the year 2021. And we can define 4-letter band password words in Azure AD password protection. And that way, those bad passwords can no longer be used in Active Directory or in Azure AD. And we can define up to 1,000. We can define up to 1,000 words in our banned password list. And then to have that flow back to our Active Directory, all we need is to install the Azure AD Password Protection Agent on all our domain controllers, because any domain controller can be used by people in our organization to change their password. And this is really easy to get going. And let me show you. David, if we could switch back to the browser.
All righty, give me one sec. There you go.
Thank you. I'm not seeing it yet on my screen, but yeah, here we go. It's also in security. So we'll click that in the breadcrumbs. And there's authentication methods. And here's that password protection blade that we're looking for. So here, I just enforce a custom list, and I think we can all agree that welcome is not a good word. We can also see spring, fall, autumn, winter, 2020, 2021. These are all words that will no longer be able to be used in passwords. And of course, if you're located in a specific area, you probably don't want to see Seahawks, for instance, in your passwords as well. Or you don't want to see popular car brands and car models, or you don't want to see anything like that. So we would just add these words to our custom enforced password list and then enable it for password protection on Windows Server Active Directory as well, and then enforce it after we have seen the impact. So in audit mode, we get statistics on how many people actually use these words in passwords. And if we're confident that our impact is not that big, that our service desk colleagues can't handle the additional load of getting people helped to come up with good passwords, then well, we could do some more communication and stuff like that before we go to enforced mode. And the only thing we do have to do now is click save, but I think you catch my drift. So let's get back to the slides, David. And let's see what Azure AD can also bring us. So this is what you do, and we've already talked about that. The password protection proxy actually gets you that top 1,000 password leaked passwords list. It actually gets you that custom enforced banned password list, and it will give it to domain controllers so that domain controllers can use that. And any colleague can, if they then change their password, then they have to come up with better passwords that don't contain all those easy words. And of course, on your domain controllers, you already have your complexity requirements set, I'm sure, but this hooks into your change password solution, or in your change password process, the same way as that complexity requirement. It uses the same password filter DLL to hook up to the change passwords. I already saw that question. Yep. And of course, the other question is, does this apply to password resets as well? Yes, because a password reset is actually a password set followed by a password change. So cool stuff. And also this is Azure AD Premium licensed, obviously. And with that, I think, David, we can show people how Netwrix is also helping to secure infrastructure services.
All right. Hey, well, thank you so much, Sander, for that excellent presentation. I like how you're able to strike a really good balance between the security and the functionality that you require on both sides, internally as well as with the cloud-based apps and functionality. So great job. Yeah, so I want to kind of cover in the next 10 minutes or so some of the ways Netwrix can help give you visibility into some of the activity happening where you're setting these things up, whether it's users, groups, where it's written activity, being able to identify, preparing for formal audits, if you have to comply with HIP, regulatory compliance standard, how can we get the information both in your Active Directory and Azure a variety of ways. So what I'll do here, I'm going to shift over to my Netwrix console. And I know for some, the Netwrix Auditor platform, there's a lot of information on our website where you can get more detail and information about our product. But I'm going to focus here on just a handful of things that we can monitor and see in Active Directory as well as Azure Active Directory activity. So what I'm showing you right now is the variety of sources that we can monitor from the cloud, and some of these other services here that you might have in your infrastructure in the cloud that you also want to monitor and bring it into a centralized database where they're focus on the setup and requirements of our service, but more the result of what the data looks like once it's been collected. And so I'm going to focus on the intelligence section here and kind of poke around, show you some of the reports, some of the alerts and risk assessments, things that we can get from our data that's collected and provide that visibility. So I'm just going to jump right into reports because they'll help us see how these are organized by those same here. So we can organize, we can run reports here from, one sec. Yeah, one reports directory, and there's nothing I've done here in this demo or in my lab environment. They're all here out of the box, either organized by service or by standard. So you see here at the bottom are various compliances preparing for a HIPAA audit. We have all the reports that you need, all organized alphabetically. So same reports, this sample or several examples of report styles, just so you get an idea of how we get the data in your domain or in Azure AD and how the information is presented. And most organizations are still making changes to their accounts, users and groups through their domain controllers, their Active Directory proper. And so if I want to get that information about who's making changes, what they're changing, when did they make the change, or who's been added and deleted as an account or a group membership, I can run these reports either on demand or preferably I have them scheduled. That way on a weekly basis I can get emailed all the reports that I need for my role. And here's the way in which the data is presented in this first example of a report. We have all the changes that have happened, and you see up at the top there's various filters where it shows you the last 2 days by default, but I can change the time frame. I can change different filters to look at certain actions only that have happened in that time frame. But you see here the output. This is the value here of all the things that are happening, whether you have one domain controller or dozens of them. That information is in the security log of the domain controllers when you join computers to your domain, when you delete users, you modify attributes. But which domain controller is in charge of making that change, and which the time and effort it takes to go to that domain controller and look through the logs to find the needle in a haystack for something that we're trying to identify is very time consuming. So what we're doing here, we're not collecting the log data, we're analyzing it and presenting it in a useful form, more of a correlation or summary. So when someone deletes a user, you can easily find out who did it, when they did it, which account was deleted or modified, and even where they were when they made the change as an admin. We even have before and after values. If someone's attributes have changed, phone numbers, departments, job titles, things like that. So the format of the data we're collecting centrally, it's 24/7 operation. We're getting this information within a couple of minutes of these changes brought into the database, and then we can filter out as well as export these reports, give them to the team that needs to be aware of this, or ideally, like I was saying earlier, you can automate the reports that you need by subscribing to them. And so this subscription allows you to either upload to a file share, maybe you're preparing for a SOX audit. So you just create a folder for SOX audit preparation, identify who's going to be notified that these reports are available, and the schedule that's appropriate. So if you go through all those reports required for HIPAA or SOX or PCI, you subscribe to all the reports in that folder, and usually monthly is a good job to show the auditors when they come knocking on the door that you've prepared for the audit for the past several months, and you have all the data that they need to cover your bases. So that's an example of just one report style, and I'm not going to go through every one of our reports in Active Directory. Some reports, though, are more specific in security implications. For example, I want to find out who's changed admin group membership, either added or deleted a member from a privileged group like domain admins. And once again, I see it broken down here by this group being modified, having a user deleted or removed and then another user added. And then if I want to be alerted that this has happened, I don't want to just wait for that report to show up at the end of the week or the end of the month. I'm going to back out a little bit and show you the alert functionality. So alerts are going to be out of the box as well. They're just turned off by default. So it's up to you to decide if you want to create your own alerts or activate the alerts that are already there for common use cases, like member added to privileged group. When I look at the alerting, it's very much like a subscription, except this is going to be sending the text message or the email message based on the conditions of the alert. And when it happens within minutes of the event, this is looking at those same groups that if there's a member added, I would be notified. Now, some alerts, it's good to have a threshold, like how many failed logins or files deleted in a certain time before you're alerted. But others, you just have one event is enough to trigger the alert. So that's, in addition to the reporting, where you get that information collected and the trail and the history, you also want to be proactive and have alerts for key events like admin group membership changes, user account status changes. If it's an account that's been enabled or unlocked recently, that is a privileged account especially, I can filter out and look at the accounts that have been changed, disabled, enabled over time. We can even see this information graphically. So let's say you want to see or send this report to someone who oversees the entire infrastructure and wants a big picture overview in this graphical view. So I can see if there's any user that's making an unusual number of changes, or maybe there's a certain date where a bunch of changes have happened. I want to investigate that. You just click on any data point, and it's going to tell you the things that have happened within that data point. In this case, that day, in the search tool, actually opens up the activity on that day and the changes in Active Directory. So very, very useful to get this information of changes, as well as what's called state and time. State and time is more a daily update. It takes a snapshot of your domain and gives you your inventory, your group membership list, your user accounts, passwords that are not required for certain accounts, or passwords that never expire. And so these are things that help us clean up our domain, because these accounts have accounts that never expire. We want to make sure that they change and conform to our security policy. And we also have alerts for that as well. So if you do your cleanup work and start making those changes, over time, your environment's going to be less risky. And we can see that in our risk assessment tool. Over time, with the daily state and time snapshot, we can see there's areas of infrastructure that need our attention. They're considered high risk. A bunch of inactive user accounts. Up here, I can just drill down and see which accounts qualify as being inactive. They're still enabled, but they haven't logged in 35 days or whatever. I can export this list. I can have another tool that we have to automate the inactive users and disable them after a certain time goes by. So I'm just giving you a sense of some of the functionality once the data has been collected that we provide to assist you in your visibility and your security. And the rest of it is just, I'm not going to, like I said, go through every single report known to man here, but you get the idea that I can have information on changes made to Active Directory, group policy. I can find out who's logging in, the most failed logins, and I could even have some of those suspicious activities like privilege escalation. If someone added a member to a group that's privileged and then removed them within a short amount of time, that could be seen as suspicious. So this has a recording of an account, Chandler Bing, who was created and put in the privileged group of domain admins by this admin and then removed 5 minutes later. And we get suspicious. I might want to look into that account and what they might have done after logging in before they were removed from that group. That temporary privilege could be a warning sign. All right, so let me show you some of the Azure ADPs. I know most of your organizations are synchronizing your Azure AD with your on-prem Active Directory. And so your user account, you're thinking, I don't need to know, I'm not creating users in Azure or I'm not managing groups, but there are a lot of things you get with the Azure monitoring to supplement what your AD Connect might be doing. So for example, if I look at user account management, I can see whether those activities for user account management originated in the on-premise Active Directory or in Azure. And so in my environment, I don't have a connection to an on-premise Active Directory, but here we have some users that were added by this suspicious admin yesterday, and the licenses that were assigned, the name and breakdown of the user, or deleting a user, or modifying a user and giving them a different status. So same idea of what you're doing with your domain in Active Directory, but now getting that visibility with Azure Active Directory, that group membership changes. This is something that with Teams, and we'll talk more about some of those applications and the security side and sensitive data on Thursday in part 2. But when someone creates a team, it's very user driven. There's going to be some groups that are created by the team service and by the user that actually is managing the membership of that team, like we can see here. And so this is not going to be in my group membership in Active Directory. This is Microsoft 365 group. Helps you track that activity and even have alerts if that's happening as well. And one of the things that we also can see, if users are logging on or attempting to log in from different parts of the world. So you might have some accounts here that are logging in and failing with a high percentage of failed login attempts over the past month. I can just click on that data point and see that this account was being used in St. Petersburg, in Australia, Victoria, Melbourne area, as well as in California. So this account, with your identity being pretty much an open account name, ways of attempting to get in with that account, that's why you need the things that Sandra was talking about to make sure that those connecting from those suspicious locations, you can be alerted with our alerting function. I have an alert that sent me an email that was happening the other day, and I put in the conditions of users who are failing in their logins outside of whatever workstation location you want to define. And by the way, over time, you see these behavior anomalies that will help you be notified or see who the riskiest users are in your environment. Like that one user that logged in, triggered a bunch of alerts so I can see their behavior over time and find out who the most suspicious users are and drill down where necessary to find out what have they been doing and is that an authorized change? And if it is, I can mark it, review it, say it's okay, or it's something I need to investigate further and see other things that the user's been up to. And on Thursday, I'll be able to go into some more of that investigation, incident investigation, but I'm just showing you here ways in which we can get the data that's been collected and even have reports out of the box, as well as any customization. I want to find out admin group role and membership changes in both my on-prem and I'm going to stop saying on-prem because of what Sandra said, but in my Active Directory domain and my Azure AD, here's roles that have been modified. Someone's been added as a Teams administrator, company administrator. I also have groups, domain admins. So just the visibility we provide is going to save you a ton of time and effort, as well as help you achieve compliance. A lot more to come on Thursday when it comes to discussing ways of securing other services we'll be looking at, like SharePoint Online, etc. So we have just a few more minutes here. I want to kind of wrap things up. I know there's some questions that have been posted, and I know we have limited time, but we'll try to get to those as much as we can. And here the slide is mentioning how, if you haven't heard the news, Netwrix and StealthBits have recently merged, providing more tools, more solutions to help you identify issues, security issues and compliance issues in your organization. And there's information on a website you can go to get some of the details. Request a demo, request a trial version. And on Thursday, I just learned about this. On Thursday, after the second session, there's going to be a drawing during the webinar, and the winner will be selected. You have to be present in both sessions to win, but this is not your 5-piece Lego Star Wars kit. This is over 7,500 pieces, almost as big as the Millennium Falcon ride in Disneyland. Not quite as big, but this is a huge collector's item. So you want to be here for that. And that is same time, but 2 days from now, hardening your hybrid environment. And Sandra will give us some more excellent advice. I'll do some demonstration on Netwrix visibility. If you want to explore our solutions in more detail, you can go to netwrix.com. There's an in-browser demo. You can play around with the platform with a tutorial. There's a 30-day trial you can download for free and install it in your environment and see what it does, as well as being able to look at the details of our future product line and portfolio with StealthBits. Okay, questions and answers. I haven't had a chance to.
I have.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, I'll let you take over. You've been.
Yeah, we have a ton of questions, which is good because people are asking. Well, they're mainly asking about licensing, but everything that I've shown you today was actually Azure AD Premium. Most of it. I've shown you some user risk and some sign-in risk as well, and that's the only Azure AD Premium. Microsoft has a short abbreviation for that, Azure AD Premium P2. It's actually Premium. But that's all. For all the other stuff, for conditional access, for Azure AD Password Protection, you need Azure AD Premium licenses. And let me see, there's also some questions on the Netwrix stuff.
Yeah, I'm scanning quickly. I'm scanning. I know time is of the essence. Let's see.
But your Netwrix, was it fully installed or on-premise, or is it part of cloud?
Yeah, so the Netwrix server is a Windows server, so it can run as a virtual machine in any cloud or in your own data center. It is, as long as it has a network connection to the sources that you're monitoring, that's the important factor. And I know there's a variety of ways to have the connections from the network server to the services you're monitoring. And we're not installing an agent. It's basic network protocols, collector account used to get the information from the services you're monitoring into the Netwrix in a SQL database, either on the same server or remote server, in order to give you that functionality of reporting, alerting, etc. Yeah, I see there's a lot of questions we didn't have a chance to address. The time is up for the webinar though, and I really appreciate your time, everyone, taking time out of your day to sit in on this webinar. We'll hopefully see you back on Thursday, and between now and then, you guys have a great day, great rest of your week, and thank you very much. The webinar is over. Thank you so much, Sander.
Thank you.
We'll see you on Thursday. All right, take care.